Today we're going to be discussing Willa Cather's story, The Namesake, written in 1907. Willa Cather is, of course, one of America's best-loved authors, having written such classics as My Antonia and Death Comes for the Archbishop. Some quick historical facts that bear on today's story. Born in Virginia in 1873, one of Cather's uncles died fighting in the Civil War as a soldier for the Confederacy. She would later assume his middle name as her own. Shortly after leaving the University of Nebraska in 1895 with a solid background in the liberal arts, she spent some years in Pittsburgh, where she would edit a magazine and later teach high school. And in 1902, she visited Europe and Paris for the first time, where she, like so many Americans of that era, promptly fell in love with the city. So Amy, why don't you give us a quick summary of The Namesake?
The story is set in Paris at the turn of the 20th century. On the eve of his return to America, Charles Bentley and 6 of his fellow American art students gather in the apartment studio of the great sculptor Lyon Hartwell. On display, ready for casting, is Hartwell's latest, and by his own lights, his best and most important figure, the Color Sergeant, a work that draws the admiration and a little bit more than envy from the art students. Moved by their response and by Bentley's impending departure, the usually reticent Hartwell tells the young men the story of his own belated and very emotional American homecoming. Born in Italy to a self-exiled American artist, Hartwell was orphaned by age 14. Still, he remained in Rome studying sculpture, attempting to fulfill his father's own ambitions. And when he came of age, he moved to Paris to continue to pursue his artistic career. 10 years later, when he was just on the cusp of some success, he was suddenly summoned to America. His grandfather died, leaving his ailing maiden aunt without any other relatives to take care of. So he's summoned to take care of her. So he remained in America for 2 years, waiting for her illness to run its course. There he languished, feeling utterly estranged from everything around him, including the family home, and especially from the bustling industrial world that was encroaching upon it. One thing only drew him near, a portrait of his boy uncle, his namesake, who he later learns had died in battle during the Civil War at age 16, covered by the federal flag he had been carrying as a color sergeant. Months later, his aunt asks him to go up to the attic to retrieve the federal flag so that it could be flown on Memorial Day for his namesake's memory. There he also found what he had been looking for, namely a trunk with his own name on it. Later that evening, he went to inspect the contents of the trunk, which included all the boy's toys, clothing, letters he had written, and other paraphernalia. But as he was about to close it, he noticed a copy of Virgil's Aeneid, in the back flyleaf of which his uncle had drawn the federal flag, initialed and dated 1862, that's the year before his uncle enlisted, and above which he had written the first 2 lines of the Star-Spangled Banner, or the opening question of the Star-Spangled Banner. The discovery engendered an epiphany. With the book in hand, he rushed down to the garden and spent the rest of the dark and ominous night beside the locust tree his namesake had planted years ago, with the flag barely visible, flapping overhead. Sitting there until the dawn's early light, he felt for the first time, he says, the pull of race and blood and kindred. He felt beating within him things that had not begun with him. Hartwell's story is concluded. The young men are riveted in silence. Bentley's cab arrives, and Bentley and the young men go downstairs while Bentley proceeds to go off to America.
Let's go back to the beginning of the story. How does Lyon Hartwell appear to his young admirers in this studio, and why?
Well, they're drawn to him first because he's a great sculptor. They're young men studying the same art, but they're also drawn to him because of his connection to America. Though Hartwell was born abroad, everyone describes him as simply being from America. So it's said that Hartwell seems to sum up all of America in his person, sort of from ocean to ocean. All of the rest of the young American sculptors are regional in some way. You know, they're from New Hampshire or they're from out west. You know, in a way, Hartwell, by not being in America, but rather being from America, that distance from America seems to enable him to sum it all up or to embody it all.
Yeah, in part, as Bentley says to him on the occasion, admiring the now finished magnum opus, the Color Sergeant, he says, I almost think that it's only because you're not really an American that you can manage something like this, that you have the heat to pull off or to carry off an idea of this sort. And Hartwell says perhaps that's the case, and uses that kind of challenge and that invitation based on their perception of him and his work to, in fact, tell them his story.
I'm struck by the degree to which Hartwell is sort of creating a republic in front of our eyes. He has these young men from various states divided by their state affiliations. They're certainly divided by self-interest, right? They're all very much interested in besting one another.
Especially, they think that in being called home, whoever is called home is taken out of the race in some way. So his story really shows them that in being called home, that's the place where they could actually gain this heat, or you know, find their subject matter.
Yeah, exactly.
That will really turn them into true artists.
Yeah, the heat was something that his father didn't have, right? I mean, he was dabbling in marble things. It never had that heat.
Marble statues, Indian princesses, and he went for the glory of art.
Right.
But he had actually nothing in him to create.
Right.
This was all imitation of something else.
Yeah, actually, the father was regarded as a renegade by the family because he didn't return home to join the Civil War. That's rather important. And though he's not entirely alienated from the family, and we know that from the fact that he names his son for his half-brother.
What attracts Lyon Hartwell to the portrait of his namesake? What is it that draws him to that? What does he see in it?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. First, there's a universal appeal. Everyone who looks at the portrait is captivated by it. The portrait is said to convey this energy and gallantry and joy in life. So it's just this very handsome young man that anyone would respond to. But I think there's also a very specific appeal for Hartwell, and we've already hinted at that by speaking about Hartwell's own father. His own father had been an expatriate, but a very dissatisfied one. He's described as the most unhappy of exiles. But in looking at this picture of his uncle, he sees the visage of his father, but the visage of his father now transformed and glorified. And he very much wants to understand the source of that.
Yeah, that's very important. In a way, the portrait gives him back the father that he never knew. So the portrait is itself very attractive, but it's more than just a portrait for him.
It's also, in addition to these very good things, this is the only sign of life or vitality that he finds on his trip home.
It's not quite right that there's no vitality in the America that he comes to. It's just that he doesn't respond to the kind of vitality
Right.
that America now evidences. I mean, we're told that the great manufacturing city, I take it it's Pittsburgh, is just a few miles from the family homestead, and he's repelled really by what he sees as this relentless energy. And it was interesting to me that energy is the word that is used to describe both the boy in the portrait. You know, he responds to his energy. But when he actually returns to America, he's repelled by this new kind of out-thrusting energy.
He is attached, as you say, to the energy in the portrait.
Yeah.
We don't know after he has his epiphany what he thinks of the energy
Of the rest of
America.
Yeah, but I take it that what we learn about his other portrayals, his other sculptures, gives us some indication. So we're told that he has a sculpture of the scout and the pioneer and the gold miner, and those are, again, examples of this sort of out-thrusting energy, but not of an industrial sort, really.
See, I would disagree slightly. There's a sentence in which America is energetic in all respects, but he's interested in the heroic and in the heroic exploits of the individuals. In addition to those things, the other thing he's doing is he's sending home statues of heroes of the Civil War, which go to battlefields and various other places to keep alive the memory of individual greatness.
So it's not only the energy, but the gallantry.
The gallantry,
That's
the nobility.
The next word there.
Now, whether he would come to see the kind of commercial spirit, the industrial spirit, the taming of the West, and all of those things, as of a piece with what his namesake had done, I don't know. But it certainly doesn't. It looks like the end of all of human gallantry, and what's left is, you know, the trees are covered with soot, the rivers are brown, and it's the old order is decayed.
Creeping, everything is dead.
And yet, we're finally, he finally does attach himself to America in the midst of this rather dismal. I'm struck by the degree to which he has to penetrate that sort of industrial, drab world in order to get to his roots, and yet he's able to do that, which is quite striking. It's only when he finds the trunk, right, that he finally really understands this person that is his namesake. Can you say something about that? Why is that? What is it about that discovery that makes it so significant?
Well, it's not entirely unrelated to his response to the portrait. I mean, besides the gallantry and the joy of life in the portrait leaves him with a question, and he wants to know what it is that enables this young man to give up everything in a moment, to sacrifice himself in the way in which he did. And so when he goes and he finds Virgil's Aeneid, in the back flyleaf of which is this uncle's drawing of the federal flag, and above that, the question asked by the Star-Spangled Banner, it is a moment that suddenly everything comes together for him. What it is that his uncle was living for, what it is that he was willing to die for. It has everything to do with the Republic.
Yeah. I mean, the discovery in the attic comes after he's already been on a quest for his uncle. I mean, his aunt is able to tell him that, oh yes, your uncle planted this one tree here in the garden. His mother put a bench around it where she could sit. Yes, he's buried in the rose garden. He finds out from an old soldier comrade of his how the uncle actually died. Tried to enlist at age 14, enlisted at age 15 in a charge against the breastworks, is carrying the flag, has it shot out from his arm, losing one arm, grabs the banner in the other, and makes it to the top of the hill, cheerfully, laughing, and is killed with the other arm shot off, and dies with the flag wrapped around him. And then he wants to find out about the Civil War, and he discovers it's a war fought by boys. And he couldn't somehow understand what this was about, and is then looking for, as Amy said, what was it that could have made these boys in the peak of life with all of this vivacity and energy give it all up? Here he is. The date is 1862 when he scribbles in the book. So it's the year before he actually gets to enlist. And here he is studying Latin and the story of the founding of Rome and doodling pictures of cannons and other things, muskets, and his mind is elsewhere. And one can't help but think that either he's repelled by the Roman example or in a way inspired by the kind of patriotic sentiment there. How does it stand with our republic, which is now absolutely imperiled, and he can't wait to get out there and serve?
Yes, that's very important. The Aeneid is about the hero Aeneas, who founds Rome really out of the ashes of Troy. So it's a kind of new life resurrected. And he wants to find out, or his uncle wanted to find out, what's happening to our republic? What's going to save our republic? How does it fare with us? Are we going to live?
Why isn't the story that the old timer tells sufficient for Hartwell? I mean, it's a pretty gripping story about the young man's exploits on the field, and it tells this tale of valor. It's striking to me that he's somehow still in quest of the truth. He hasn't yet, glimpsed the inner truth of his namesake.
The old timer has given an account of what happened, but it doesn't really. I don't think to Hartwell the mere facts don't somehow explain the reason. And he reads about the Civil War, and even that doesn't explain the reason.
So it's that instantaneous glimpse of this boyish patriotism when you see the drawing in the book. And then the love that motivates that.
Yeah, but it's the drawing in the book. It's the first time he sees a deed of his uncle. He sees
an artistic
deed of his uncle. He sees that, and he sees all the doodling all over the book, but especially that drawing of the federal flag at the end.
Oh, that I like very much, that somehow he thinks the young boy is artistic in his way also. And what the young boy goes on to become is a flag bearer, and you could say that in a certain sense, Hartwell, the sculptor, also becomes a flag bearer.
That's very nice.
Right? That he creates these displays of the aspiration of the American character.
Which means that the deeds by themselves, unless one can symbolically represent them, either in picture or in story, not enough.
They're not self-interpreting.
The old-timer gave him the bare facts.
Yeah.
The meaning of those bare facts requires something.
And so it's not so much Aeneas as Virgil.
Well,
or I mean, it's the cooperation or
exactly.
the interdependence of those two.
Yeah, and in this case, what's very nice is that the name of this story's Virgil and the name of this story's Aeneas is Lyon Hartwell. Right?
Yeah.
In other words, the subject and the author come together through their name and the kinship. What he discovers, first of all, is what moved his namesake. It's his first access to him through this kind of self-revelatory account of what moved his soul.
And it leads to Hartwell, the sculptor's own resurrection, right? He describes himself as really having been dead before this. His cosmopolitanism has left him dead, and he now feels rooted and alive, like Lazarus brought back from the dead. I also think there's a nice moment. I mean, the last line of the story, the last word of the story has this other young sculptor going back to America, and he departs from the train station, which is named after Lazarus.
What exactly happens to Hartwell on the night of Memorial Day?
He's just been put in contact with what he takes to be the sort of guiding nerve of his namesake boy uncle's life. It's a dark and miserable night. He's got the Aeneid inscribed in his hand, and he sits under the flag, which can't be seen. And it really is kind of, as Amy said, a kind of Francis Scott Key moment for him. And he says, the experience of that night coming so overwhelmingly to a man so dead almost rent me in pieces. It was the same feeling that artists know when we rarely achieve truth in our work, the feeling of union with some great force, of purpose and security, of being glad that we have lived. For the first time, I felt the pull of race and blood and kindred, and felt beating within me things that had not begun with me. It was as if the earth under my feet had grasped and rooted me, and were pouring its essence into me. I sat there until the dawn of morning, and all night long my life seemed to be pouring out of me and running into the ground. I mean, the end is especially strange to me. It sounds as if he's dying. I mean, he's losing his life's blood, and is turning into a plant. That is to say, well, I mean, that the image is that he is now rooted like his namesake uncle's tree, standing in the same ground, and like the flagpole beneath which he's sitting as well.
But you need roots in order to live. A plant needs roots in order to live. And this is not he is not describing his death, he's describing his rebirth.
Let's go with this roots and soil concept for a second. It's often said that America isn't a nation founded on the notion of roots in soil, blood and soil, but rather a nation that's founded on ideas and ideals. Does this suggest that Cather has another view of that? How are we to understand this particular scene in relation to this larger question of ideas versus roots?
Yeah, whenever you emphasize blood, race, and kindred,
Right.
that doesn't sound particularly American.
Right.
It could be German, it could be anything. And we pride ourselves in the fact that principles do inform us. But I think in this case, it is that attachment, that emotional attachment, which Cather also points out, which stories in general point out, that's as necessary for the attachment to the nation as those principles. And in this case, the story happens to be a story that enables him to find meaning in his own patriotism. And the patriotism, as I said, is informed by the principles of the Republic. So while he emphasizes blood, race, and kindred, I think you cannot simply separate it from the fact that it's the Star-Spangled Banner that he looks to, that it's the federal flag that he draws, and all that stands for.
Right, so that this is blood which has been spent or sacrificed for a cause, the cause of union, and union as represented by this flag. So it does seem to me that he's really achieved a kind of coming together of blood and the ideas.
Right.
The principles by themselves, I don't think, are enough to attach anybody. And there are lots of people who could affirm these principles and who can live elsewhere and who might be sympathetic to America. But really, to belong depends not only on embracing those principles, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. It depends, I think, on being attached to the history of the people who've lived their life under those principles and have struggled and sacrificed to preserve them and to perpetuate them. And in this particular case, what he sees is that it's his own personal legacy, not only in family ties, but also in the very name that he carries. These are lives that have in fact been spent to protect and preserve not just the principles, but the entire way of life and the people who live under those principles.
And it's not just the legacy of the Civil War, but his father was born there, his grandfather was born there, his great-grandfather during the Revolutionary times founded that homestead.
Right.
And it's the only place for miles around where the original trees are still preserved.
And the trees are from the Revolutionary times.
Yeah.
People have mixed their life and their blood with this place and with its cause.
Right.
That I think is also necessary, really, as are the memories of those things, which stories and emblems and sculptures, I think provide, as I think this story makes clear.
Yeah, his sculptures aren't abstracts of Lady Liberty, something like that. Indian goddesses and Indian princesses and goddesses. They're specific episodes in American history, right? The pioneers, the gold rush folks, the settlers. They're sculptures that combine kind of specific history of this country with some sense of a larger principle that's behind it. They all symbolize larger principles, but at the same time, they're quite specific and quite grounded in the history of this place.
They provide the robust national memory that is needed in order to perpetuate that kind of attachment to America.
At the end of the story, or at the end of his discovery, Lyon Hartwell, of course, goes back to Paris. Now, why does he do that? What's the story here?
Do you fault him?
Gosh, I don't know. That's He goes back to Paris in the name of art, of course, right? And yet he's taken something of America with him. Something of his own past and something of America with him. And at that distance, he's able perhaps to capture America better than if he were immersed in it, going back to Diana's first point about there's something about being from America. He's not an American, he's from America. There is a necessary distance there.
Yeah, and he is the flag-bearer. I mean, he's planting the American flag solidly on Parisian soil. I'm all for him. It also seems to me that Cather is just very aware also of the demands of art and what that required in this time period. You really couldn't carry out this kind of endeavor purely on American soil. So he's still in the process of perfecting his craft and his technique. I mean, he actually says that he's wanted to do this color sergeant sculpture for 15 years, but he hasn't really been confident of his abilities to carry it off yet.
He remains very much of the United States, even though he is not in it. Unlike many people who live here and are not really of it.
He is teaching the Americans. He sends home his sculptures to adorn our cemeteries and our public places. And he's, in a way, he's offering a somewhat beautified picture of ourselves to ourselves, a more heroic picture of ourselves, and gracing the national memory in that way. But he says he came late to his citizenship. It's a partial citizenship, however philanthropic, not to participate in one's own self-government. Cather herself, although she fell in love with Paris, didn't become an expatriate, really, and told her American stories and glorified the American experience. without ceasing to be one amongst us. So I think there's at least that difficulty about Lyon Hartwell.
He's established this little republic in his studio, right?
He's fostering citizenship in them.
Exactly.
Right.
And he is encouraging them to go back.
That's right. He's telling the story so that the fellow who's going back won't feel badly, and he's now armed with this story and this.
And in a way, as the flag itself is an emblem, he's making a one out of the many in this group. That's another way in which, by representing the color sergeant for them and telling them this story on this occasion, he's in a way doing the job that the flag does for, that it represents and that it does really for a disparate nation.
Yes.
Yeah, that's nice. You said originally the 7 young men come from all parts of the United States. He emblemizes America itself from ocean to ocean. And that's precisely what his story does for them.
Yes. And it ends at night, right? His story ends at night with now it's silent. They're no longer visible to each other as individual entities. They've all become sort of united in this story, and in the darkness, the only thing you see are the cigarette tips,
Right.
the rocket's red glare, going back and forth. So anyway, you get the. Let's talk about the flag more directly and explicitly for a second. It's a recurring theme, obviously, and it keeps showing up in this story again and again. What are we to make of the flag? What is this story telling us about the American flag?
Well, among other things, we could go into something about what the flag represents and how it shows us one out of many by simply the way in which it's laid out. But I think that it's an image. It's an image which speaks thousands of words for us.
And it does seem to me that a nation founded on an idea is probably more in need of that kind of tangible symbolism. So that, I mean, if I just think about my own attachments, I grew up in Minnesota. I think of myself as a Minnesotan still, even though I haven't lived there since I was a teenager. And yet I think I have no particular attachment to the Minnesota flag. So, and I don't think most people do. We all come from one of the states, but we're not attached to the flags of the states. So that the really rooted place doesn't actually need a flag. So I actually think there's a connection between the ideational nature of our founding and the need for these symbols. And so it's so interesting that this then becomes sort of the foundation of his own rootedness.
The flag, which is now has this iconic feature in American life and really is the emblem of the land I love, the home of the free and the brave. The flag before the Civil War didn't have that meaning. In fact, in the story, it's the federal flag, which means in the story it stands for the Union as opposed to the flag of the rebellion. And so the flag acquires also the meaning of the history of the history of the defense of the republic for which it stands. So it's not just some kind of abstract embodiment of one out of many. One additional thing, the flag does these things like many symbols silently. You know, you bring things to it. The Star-Spangled Banner adds something, the Pledge of Allegiance adds something. But I'm not sure whether stories like Cather's stories don't help us even more than the flag by itself. And it was the story about the flag and its meaning as carried by the Flagbearer.
Needs an artist to tell it.
Yeah, and maybe even needs a storyteller more than a sculptor.
Well, let's explore that for a moment, this question of the relationship between art and stories, right? The art that Hartwell presents us with, and the story here that Cather writes.
Yeah, okay. I would say one thing about that, and I think you can see it in what we're told of the sculpture. The sculpture of the color sergeant leaves out the gory details of the actual incident. I mean, we're told that the young boy lost both of his arms. Both of them were shot off. Cather's story is somehow truer, maybe, than the sculpture. The sculpture engages in a certain kind of idealization or beautification. I mean, you could claim that it captures the inner truth of the moment in beautifying it. It captures the young boy's heart. But Cather's story seems to me more complete in that it captures all of those elements and can present all of those elements to us.
Well, it enables us to experience what the young boy experienced, which we otherwise would have no access to. So in that sense, it certainly is fuller. And in that sense, even the flag or an emblem or an image depends upon talking about it, talking with others about it, to give it some meaning. It doesn't, you put the image up there, and it's not self-evident that it's going to speak to you in the way in which it speaks to this young man.
And so that the literature can lead to a more mature patriotism, is I guess what I would say. That Hartwell, the sculptor, he's almost still in the grip of this kind of boyish
Well, he's in the
patriotism.
grip of heat.
The story of what actually happened to the boy is a news story. It's in the local newspaper with all the gory details of the sort you get in the local newspapers, right? Then Hartwell is now telling the story to the young Americans, every word of which is, of course, Cather's, but it's his narrative.
Right.
He's giving them the full story, newspaper account included, along with his artistic representation of what he takes to be the heart of the matter. I mean, the beautiful heart of the matter. Cather gives us Hartwell, newspaper story, sculpture, and then some. And we're left in a position, really, to work on all of these levels at once. I think there are sometimes that pictures are worth 1,000 words, Diana.
Now, I would like to have both, of course, to preserve the image as absolutely vital. But I think you're more right than wrong. I think the story about that, speaking about that image, is what vivifies it for us. It's not an accident that this is a story within a story.
Right, I agree.
And so even Cather recognizes the need for stories to be told.
Told and retold. Yeah, and although this story is now more than 100 years old, I just find it immensely moving because notwithstanding all of the changes that have taken place in this century plus since the story is written, and a half century more from the Civil War, this story rekindles a kind of an appreciation of what it has taken in order for us to live here with this kind of freedom and prosperity, to have the luxury sometimes to forget about those things, and to know the price that has been paid and what actually goes into the fact that the banner still waves.
Let's go back to Amy's point for a second. Why stories? What was the point of collecting stories and poems and songs?
It reflects the point we were making earlier. The stories speak more directly to the heart, which has to be engaged, as well as the mind. So that stories do precisely what these artistic embodiments try to do. They try to incorporate that energy.
So it brings the heat, so to speak.
It brings the heat.
The sculptor's last name is Hartwell. Right? Get your
Makes the heart
properly
well.
disposed. Yeah.
Just as Hartwell is looking for meaning for his life, most people do. And patriotism is one way to give meaning to one's life. How do you convey that to somebody? It's not by arguments. We could tell you everything that the America stands for, and it might not inspire you. But to have an example which makes the same point and dramatically enacts it enables you not only to identify with that person who is enacting it, but to embrace that. So I would say it's another way in which national attachment, which is patriotism, becomes invigorated.
Let's go back to the beginning, the namesake. What's the importance of the namesake?
What does it mean to name somebody for somebody? It means that you think that the life of the person for whom you're naming your child has some significance or ought to have some significance for the new life coming forward. And for the person who is the younger version of the namesake, I mean, both of them are, in a way, you could call them both namesakes. But the younger person would somehow think that his life should be informed for the sake of the name that he has been given. And then the question is, how do you do honor to your name? Because the name is not just yours alone, but it is an inheritance. And here, Hartwell makes an effort to come to terms with who it was for whom he is named. And when he feels the blood and the kinship and the race within him at this time, it's as if his uncle's blood now lives in him in a way in which it never has before. And that for the first time, he's sort of earned the name and to some extent the cause for which his uncle spent his brief vitality. It in a way raises the question for all of us, what would it mean to do honor to those who've come before us, even if we don't carry literally their exact name? Can one feel the ties of race and blood and kindred and the causes to which our ancestors gave what was theirs? Whose namesake are we? And what would it take to live up to that inheritance?
So the namesake is not the person for whom you're named, but you.
Well, I think, technically speaking, the namesake is the younger person who is named for someone else. But you would say, he's my namesake. That could go either way. But the idea, for the sake of the name, and that even has certain religious overtones, things done for the sake of the name, that's a summons to some kind of higher purpose, and to recognize. In fact, that's in a way what's wrong with Hartwell to begin with. Hartwell has no memory.
He has no real purpose.
Thanks to his father's having left everything for art, he's robbed his son of any memory till misfortune brings him home and offers him a great gift. And thanks to his memory of the past, he has a glorious future. That, it seems to me, is our circumstance. And this connection through the name is the beginning of a recognition of where we've come from and what we owe.
One other point about naming. I know it has a kind of religious overtone, but literally when you name a child, to name something is to call it into being, and that gives it its life. And that's what he comes to realize.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been a terrific conversation with the editors of a wonderfully informative and even inspiring new volume entitled What So Proudly We Hail, The American Soul in Story, Speech, and Song. Thank you all for watching, and thank you, editors, Amy Cass, Leon Cass, and Diana Schaub.
Thanks very much, Bill.
Thank you.